Please join me in welcoming Condoleezza Rice, the Tad and Diane Toby Director of the Hoover Institution and former U.S. Secretary of State. Also introducing George Lee, co-head of the Goldman Sachs Global Institution.
All right, well, they weren't kidding about there being some noise.
That's right,
so,
yes.
We will endeavor to speak up so that you can all hear us. Dr. Rice, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Can you hear me out there? All right, I'll use my best choir voice.
Okay, a little bit better?
Yeah.
Move this up, perhaps? Okay. I might have to do this, which should be embarrassing. Okay, let me provide a little framing, then we'll get into our discussion. As we discussed just outside, we find ourselves in a moment. Buggy mic. We find ourselves in a moment. I don't know if there's another mic, possibly?
I saw a handheld.
We find ourselves in a moment of collision between significant change in very advanced technology together with tumult in geopolitics. That, I think, sets the backdrop of one of the most important things you're doing among many things at Stanford. So why don't we start by talking a little bit about the Stanford Emerging Technology Review, which you have spearheaded and addresses this unique collision, this unique moment.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, and it is really an extraordinary moment. We were talking outside that probably never in human history have you had both this volume of change and the pace of change that you're seeing in really transformational technologies. And so we take advantage of the fact at Hoover that we sit and are part of Stanford University. Senator Stanford left us a lot of land. So all of our schools are in proximity to each other. So I can walk 10 minutes to the best computer scientists in the world, 15 minutes to the best bioengineers, 10 minutes to the best roboticists. And so what we've done is to ask the scientists who are still in the labs. So these are not retired scientists. They are at the frontiers of these technologies. And we've said, can you tell us where this is going so that we might be able to better inform society and our leaders about the implications for the economy, the implications for national security, because there's a problem, which is usually policymakers are several steps behind what's actually happening. And look, regulators will regulate even if they don't really understand what they're regulating. And so we take it as our mission to try to look out over those frontiers with the scientists and then make that available to policymakers in we hope, a digestible form, which we call the Stanford Emerging Technology Review.
And as we, I can't catch a break here. Here we go.
There you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as we discussed outside, one could forgive policymakers today because the rate of change in many different vectors of technology progress seems unusual, to say the least, perhaps unprecedented. And so that locality, that proximity must be extremely valuable. That also intersects with something we discussed, which is the value of fundamental research.
Yes.
Maybe, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Well, this is a moment when I think as a country we need to go back and tell the story of the role of fundamental research in scientific progress, in scientific and technological competitiveness, and in simply making daily life better. So right after World War II, a man named Vannevar Bush, who had run technology for the United States during the war quite successfully, Vannevar Bush came up with a great idea. The federal government, the Defense Department, the Energy Department, the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, NIH, would actually fund universities to do fundamental research. Now, it was done in the following way. The government didn't look out and try to say, here are some winners and losers. There would be a competition among scientists for the best ideas at the frontiers of knowledge. Now, this worked brilliantly. And what I'm now trying to get people to understand is that fundamental research is different than what you would see in a commercial entity. Look, I'm one of the world's biggest capitalists, all right? I believe in markets. But I also understand that if you tried to leave this to commercial entities, you would have a different set of incentives than the scientist who gets up every morning and says, you know, I'd like to know why that does that. And so you want that ability to really just push the frontiers without deciding whether or not it's going to be commercializable. Another reason that it worked, and this is a great story, a good friend of mine, a man named Bill Perry. Bill Perry was one of the smartest human beings I ever knew. And he was Undersecretary for Research and Engineering for the Carter administration in the Defense Department. He testified before Congress in 1978, and they asked him about personal computers. He said, I see absolutely no reason why anybody would need a personal computer. And Bill would tell that story to say, that's why the government shouldn't pick winners and losers. Now, any great research university could make the claim that I'm about to make, but since I'm from Stanford, I'll make it for Stanford. It's true, by the way, at not just the so-called elite universities, wonderful places like Purdue and Illinois that are leading in engineering, University of Alabama, Birmingham, a real medical wonder in what they're doing in biomedical research. But at Stanford, the transistor that became Hewlett-Packard was found. The double helix was discovered at Stanford. Stem cells were discovered by a scientist who is still there. And Google came out of Stanford. Now that's just Stanford. If you look around the country, you will see that that is the case for every place. So you have fundamental research, which then allows us to be at the frontiers of biomedical and engineering. It allows us to use that for national security if necessary, but more importantly, it has driven our economic development too. There's a reason the United States of America leads in innovation, and we break up that system at our own peril. We don't actually have a plan B, George.
Well, we're just discussing that, and I couldn't agree more. This also clearly a capitalist, given where I'm from, but this the ability to supplant the profit motive with that ability to step back, bring multiple threads together. You see that in fundamental research. And so I ardently agree that the academy is central to our progress as a nation, but it's also in a moment of uncertainty itself.
Yes.
Perhaps talk about how you think about the role of government funding for academic research, how we should find the right balance, et cetera.
Well, I think that we've had the right balance. Look, the United States of America is a miracle when you think about our technological and innovative, really dominance internationally. I also have to say that, and look, universities have made a lot of mistakes. I'd be the first to say a lot of mistakes. But they're also kind of the gold standard internationally. It's where everybody wants to study, particularly in tertiary, in advanced study. So the only question I would ask, if you're thinking about cutting back on federal funding, I'd ask two questions. You say you want to compete with China. Exactly how are you going to do that if you don't have the innovation ecosystem? And secondly, what's your other option? Now, many years ago, we had something called Bell Labs. And Bell Labs was extraordinary. But when the baby bells broke up, it became a cost center. And Bell Labs didn't survive. By the way, all of those scientists from Bell Labs fled to universities where they won multiple Nobels. So what is the other option if you're going to say we're going to start to cut federal funding for research? It won't come from the commercial sector. It shouldn't come from the commercial sector. We also have a nice pattern, which is what we do. We discover something in the lab. Somebody says, maybe that's commercializable, so I'm going to get a license for it. Then they say, maybe I can get funding from these people called venture capitalists. I'll get Series A, I'll get Series B, Maybe at some point I'm going to go public, and before you know it, you do have Google. So that's why I think we've got a good thing going, and I really hope we don't sacrifice it, particularly at this moment when we are in a technological race with the Chinese.
I would be remiss if I didn't add to this a question about immigration policy. We have this bounty of drawing extraordinary people from around the globe to come to places like Stanford and University of Illinois, Purdue, et cetera. And there seem to be shifting sands about our attitude and policy towards that in government and in a way in society. How can we make sure that we continue to attract the best people, but perhaps more important, keep them here on our soil to lead change?
Yeah.
Just you referenced Google, two immigrant founders,
yes.
as are many in our shared home of Silicon Valley.
Yes, yes. Well, the first thing is that let's say that no country should lose control of its borders. Right? Let's stipulate that. And over the last several years, we did. So absolutely, the border has to be secure. We then have to say, we actually are a country that has been built on immigration. If I go out into this room, I will find names, surnames from almost every corner of the globe. And that's been our great genius, is to be able to bring people who bring that energy, they bring those smarts, and they want to be a part of a place where it didn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. I think we are in, particularly in what I'll call the high end of immigration, so the H-1B visas that people need, where frankly we don't train enough engineers. We really do need to import people. It is also the case that our demography without immigration kind of looks like the demography of countries that are stagnating. So there are lots of reasons to argue for immigration. I do think, and we need to understand this better, when people say that Americans should be trained for these jobs, they are right. They should be. We did not do a good job, particularly at the lower end of the skills levels of training people for jobs. So if we wanted to bring manufacturing back tomorrow, we wouldn't have electricians, we wouldn't have the welders to do it. So we absolutely do have to do that. But to say that is not to say, all right, so we close ourselves off from the world while we do that. So somehow we have to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time here.
That in a way is the balance I was referring to. So we could talk policy all day, but let's talk a little bit of technology. You articulate in the report 10 frontier technologies that are most strategic. AI garners the most attention, and I think we'd be hard-pressed not to start there. Tell us a little bit about your perspective on it, the pace of change, the import, and then we'll come back for a second to policy around that.
Well, AI is both a technology and an enabling technology. So we have to recognize that one reason that it's getting primacy of place is if you talk about drug discovery, you're talking about both bioengineering and AI. So these technologies they're cross-cutting themes with all of them. When I think about AI, I think about the tremendous possibilities in education, tremendous possibilities in food supply, tremendous populations in industrial productivity, and national security as well. So AI, I think, is going to make better a whole range of aspects of life. I'll give you an example. So there are people who are experimenting with more personalized education. I was actually very good at math in school, but I was lousy at geometry. I couldn't tell a parallelogram from a square. I would have benefited by being able to slow down and learn geometry on a slower pace. So the ability to personalize is something that the AI assistant, AI pilot may allow you to do. When I think about AI, I know that there are some kind of scary things about it, but my view is run hard and run fast. I'm a believer that, look, human beings have been better at the technology than at the wisdom. Let's give that a primacy of place. The nuclear revolution, you could turn on the lights, you could do medical isotopes, you also built the bomb. So I fundamentally understand that. But we are in an all-out race right now with a country that is adversarial. And the Chinese, the difference here is if you're the United States of America and something goes wrong, we will have investigative reporting. We will have congressional hearings. Every single one of us will know the story. You think that's going to happen in an authoritarian regime? No. They will treat it as they did COVID. Secretive, hiding. And so I want to win this race. I sometimes do a little thought experiment. What if the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany had won the race to the atomic bomb? We might have lived in a very different world. And so I'm run hard, run fast. I know there are going to be some mistakes. I trust our democracy to catch them.
And we might not have won those races without a progressive perspective on immigration to bring us back to that node. And you're right. I mean, what's interesting thing about AI is that AI, as you say, not only a technology, it also encodes human values, culture, and indeed policy. You write in your paper about technology is policy today. Yes. We'll talk about China in a second, but talk a little bit about the cultural influence of this technology and therefore the importance of it being led from democratically driven.
Yeah, well, just the very nature of the technology means that it encodes certain values, it encodes certain historical values. And so I would rather that the ones that are encoded are ones around freedom, not around surveillance, as an example. I would rather that it encode a sense that historical data can be biased. So I was with somebody who said that they'd been asked, can AI tell you the perfect military officer? If you wanted the perfect military officer, what would AI tell you? It would tell you, born in the South, people who had military experience were in the family and went to West Point. There's a certain bias that is encoded or built into that algorithm. So again, I think in our society we will be more aware of those biases, more transparent about those biases, and this is another reason that I think we want our values encoded.
So you said it, and I don't think anyone would disagree. We are in a race with China to define this technology. The United States benefited greatly from driving the creation of the internet and the proliferation of open standards around the world. We find ourselves in a similar moment. What can we do as a country to make sure that we have a similarly influential role in the definition of this critical platform?
Well, the only way that you have a role in the critical role in the definition is you lead. And you try also not to get surprised. We were talking outside. One of my big concerns is I really don't think we have any idea how to collect in an intelligence way on this technology. And by the way, a lot of it's going to be in open source. And so DeepSeek, which just came onto the scene, I don't know a national security person who wasn't stunned by DeepSeek, and I don't know a computer scientist who was surprised. So somehow those two worlds have to come together.
I mean, hence, really, that is in some ways a object case study of what you're doing with the Emerging Technology Review. It's that collision. It's that collision,
but it's also, again, this is such a friend of mine, very fine computer scientist, Fei-Fei Li, calls AI a civilizational technology because it's going to be in and around everything. And so citizens, not just policymakers, but citizens also need to understand it, and we're hoping that the Stanford Emerging Technology Review speaks in language that the citizen can understand too. I can vouch that it does because I'm not a technologist, and when I read it, I went back, our first draft, I went back and said, okay, could we make that more in English for those of us who don't have engineering degrees? So that's what we're trying to do. And I'll say one other thing about policymakers. Let me give credit where credit is due. I think there are some very positive signs. You're starting to get almost all of the agencies to try to get technical talent in, which is not easy because, you know, if you work for the government, you're not going to have the same financial incentives that you would have in the commercial sector. You might have to bring people in for shorter periods of time, but I see all of the agencies trying to do that. I also see on the Hill that there are a few senators and congresspeople who are taking it on themselves to educate themselves. They're real leaders. Senator Mark Warner, Senator Todd Young. There are a lot of these, Chris Coons, on both sides of the aisle, who are really taking it on themselves to understand these technologies. And if we're fortunate, the same thing will happen that happened in the nuclear age. So in the nuclear age, you had what we call the national security senators. They were people like Sam Nunn, and Joe Biden was one of them, and Dick Lugar. And so if it was a national security issue, and by the way, they then got staffs that really were very familiar as well. So if it was a national security issue, Senator Smith, who maybe didn't really understand what the SALT Treaty was all about, didn't have to try to go and educate himself. If he was a Democrat, he could go to Sam Nunn, a Republican, go to Dick Lugar. It was actually quite bipartisan. And so having people who are able to translate is also going to be important on the Hill, and we hope that the Stanford Emerging Technology Review will help some of those people too.
Those policy questions are not only domestic, they're international. And I wonder how you think the global governance will evolve for this phenomenon. I think we were headed in a more multilateral way, or multilateral direction. How do you read it now, and what do you think is the right result for us as a nation?
Yeah, I'm going to be cautious about multilateralism too early. Because this is essentially right now, particularly in AI. Now, we didn't talk about synthetic biology, which is, I think, equally interesting and important, or robotics. But right now, it's essentially a two-country race, the United States and China. Because of Oxford, the UK actually has some AI capability. Unfortunately, Europe is not really on the scoreboard in the same way. And one of my concerns, and I've said this to my European friends quite openly, one of my concerns is don't let Europe become the regulation infrastructure for other people's innovation. I would rather see Europe push in terms of innovation, which some are trying to do. But if we're going to multilateralize it all, let's start with people who have common values. And so maybe some of the democracies could start to think about it. You might even get, even with adversaries, a sense that there are some things you probably don't want to use these technologies for. So for instance, suppose we said we don't want these technologies to cause mass casualties. Right? That might be one way to think about it. Suppose we said we don't ever want to lose the human being in the nuclear loop. I mean, you could imagine some things that are so much in the interests of both sides that you could begin to have early conversations about those kinds of things. But the technology itself, I would rather keep pushing forward.
Yeah, and as we've discussed, the pace of change is so startling that you could build an apparatus of policy that could turn out to be very ill-suited to the directionality of change and innovation.
Absolutely.
So I think that's wise counsel, which is to be deeply aware of the risks, but be emergent in the way that we frame and govern them.
That's right.
That leads me to another question that you're uniquely suited to answer, which is one of the domains of policy that this will influence is diplomacy itself, intelligence gathering. We may get to defense in a moment, but how do you think about that landscape? How will it change that craft?
Well, since I'm in the process of trying to get my students to understand that writing something on ChatGPT is not actually learning it, I'm not sure that I want my briefings written by ChatGPT if I'm a diplomat. But look, I think there is a lot. Let's just talk about operationally. There's a lot of diplomacy that is pretty tedious. And you know, it's kind of gathering up all the information. I could imagine that you could use large language models to, let's say, comb all of the data for me on what has happened with trade policy over the last 50 years, right? So I think much like it's going to change a lot of white collar work, it could change the way that we do some of the more, I call them tedious, but let me say bulk kinds of collection that we need to do. I don't think you could say, I really would like to know everything that Vladimir Putin has said since he was deputy mayor of St. Petersburg about Ukraine. Now that would take some young officer forever to do that, so maybe that's another way that it gets used. But I don't think it is going to replace instinct in diplomacy. A lot of diplomacy is having to listen to the other guy, and you try to hear things that you didn't know going in. So if it's something that has to be predicted from the past, you're not going to get there. I can remember many times sitting in a room, particularly with, for instance, the Russians, and thinking, oh, I think I just heard a place of overlap there. So a seasoned diplomat is always going to be better at that, I think. So I don't think diplomats will be replaced, just to get to the bottom line.
But in
At
a
least
way,
I hope not.
Yeah, right. Their senses can be elevated. Their, as you say, a lot of rote work can be sublimated and outsourced. You know, I think, as you say, very consistent with what we see across the across white-collar work. So let's talk about defense. We talked about AI being super consequential for national productivity, economics, and indeed culture. Defense, and we're seeing this play out in the European theater today. Talk a little bit about why that is going to change and the importance of AI and these many technologies on that.
Yeah, well, I was asked at a session a while ago, will AI and these other technologies end up on the battlefield? There's not a single technology in human history that hasn't ended up on the battlefield. And so, yes, it will. In some ways, it will improve our capabilities. For instance, one of the hardest things that we face is discerning, when you're not talking about marching armies, right? You're talking about, let's say, terrorist cells. Discerning what's a terrorist cell and what's a village. Right? This is actually consequential because you must destroy the terrorist cell, but you don't want to destroy innocent people. The identification possibilities with AI are such that maybe you enhance the ability to do this so that it's safer in a sense. Right. Definitely in training, I've been told by people who are responsible for training that it will be possible to train pilots or others and not put them in harm's way. So a lot of ways that I think you could improve. I try to stay away from the scary scenarios myself. You know, if AGI really does come about and somebody puts it in a robot and now you're kind of in Star Wars category, I try to stay away from those. I just don't want to be surprised, which is why, again, intelligence is very important. Finally, I think just in terms of the possibilities that we're watching, I mean, what's just happened between Ukraine and Russia is just extraordinary. It still took kind of the old-fashioned thing of getting trucks inside and so forth. but the possibilities of understanding how to do something remotely, really great. So I look forward to AI in defense. I will say the Defense Department needs to rely on the private sector here. I don't really believe that the Pentagon is going to be able to do bespoke kind of AI functions because it's going to move too fast. And by the time you've let the contract and it's been made over budget and 3 years behind schedule, it will have been gone. So I'm encouraging the Pentagon, go out there. There are a lot of companies that do this. They do it well. Go pull it off the shelf.
And reforming procurement approaches to
yes,
that, critically important.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Rice, I think we are out of time, but I know that the audience will join me in thanking you for a lifetime of work dedicating to making this country safer. And to your commitment in your recent work of bringing all of that wisdom to helping us guide this extraordinary moment in technology that will define our national destiny. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you.